Our next speaker, Marta Weiss, is curator of photographs at the Victoria and Albert Museum. She joined the V&A in 2007 after 2 years as a Chesterdale Fellow in the Department of Photographs at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She holds a BA in the History of Art from Harvard and an MA and PhD from Princeton, with a special focus in those instances on the history of photography. Marta is the author of 2 books and numerous articles and catalog essays on topics ranging from Victorian photo collage to Diane Arbus. Dr. Weiss has curated exhibitions at the Princeton University Art Museum, Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the V&A. Those V&A exhibitions have included Staying Power, photographs of Black British experience, 1950s to 1990s, that was in 2014. Making It Up, photographic fictions, that was 2013. Light from the Middle East, new photography, the year earlier. Signs of a Struggle, photography in the wake of postmodernism, the year before that. She's cranking out one a year. It's really impressive. The Libraries of Light, photographic books from the V&A collection. Marta is the curator of the international touring exhibition Julia Margaret Cameron, opening in November of 2015 at the V&A, you see what I said? And accompanied by a catalog published by the V&A and MAC. Her presentation this afternoon is titled Madonnas, Goblets, and Trees, Collecting Photography at the South Kensington Museum. Please join me in welcoming Marta Weiss.
Thank you for that generous introduction. And thank you to all the organizers of this symposium for having me here today. I'm really delighted to be here. So let's get started. The South Kensington Museum, which is now the Victoria and Albert Museum, was established in 1852, and here, yet again, we have the Great Exhibition of 1851. The museum was built using the profits of the Great Exhibition, and as Sophie mentioned, British photography didn't fare that well at the Great Exhibition by comparison to photographs from other nations, and the same was perceived to be true of British art and design more broadly. And so one of the founding ideas behind the South Kensington Museum was to make it into a place to educate British artists, designers, manufacturers, and to improve the taste of the public. Photography was part of the institution from the very beginning. So although the theme of this symposium is 150 years of collecting photography, at the V&A, collecting photography actually stretches back 163 years, all the way to 1852. And we like to claim that we were the first museum in the world to collect photographs, and I think that an event like this is actually the perfect opportunity to test out that claim and see if it holds up in this audience. So most of the photographs that were initially collected by the museum were photographs of works of art that were meant to be useful to designers, artists, manufacturers. They were photographs of works of art, of architecture, travel photographs, photographs that included this stunning set of salt prints that were donated to the museum by Prince Albert. And these are photographs taken of a princely collection in what's now Poland. It was a collection that belonged to a Prussian baron. And they were photographed as examples of applied arts. He himself actually tried to circulate the objects themselves to schools of applied arts, but then just realized that photography was a way of creating a kind of museum without walls, a traveling exhibition without the need to subject these fragile objects to travel itself. And this is just one example of the types of photographs that were collected early on by the V&A, or the South Kensington Museum. By 1859, the library had acquired over 8,000 prints, including work by Maxime Duchamp, Roger Fenton, and Edward Baldus, who seems to be destined to come up in every single lecture so far. But today, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the South Kensington Museum in general, but I'm going to be focusing on Julia Margaret Cameron. The V&A may have started collecting photographs more than 150 years ago, but it was exactly 150 years ago that the museum acquired the pioneering photographs of Julie Margaret Cameron. In 1865, the museum not only acquired 114 photographs directly from her, but they also exhibited them. And it was her only museum exhibition during her lifetime. And in 1868, Cameron used 2 rooms at the museum as a portrait studio, perhaps qualifying her as its first artist in residence. And on this photograph I'm showing here, this is one, I should just mention, with I think just one exception, all the Julie Margaret Cameron photographs I'm going to show today were all part of this initial acquisition that came directly from her. And this one I'm including the entire amount, so you can see both the original inscriptions, the title, From Life, the signature, Julie Margaret Cameron, and a quote here, who knows not, I'm sorry, I can't remember what it is, who knows not Circe, daughter of the sun, something like that. And then, of course, we've got later museum inscriptions about it being a study for a painting and this lovely typed label that's been pasted on it. So another lesson in kind of what becomes of these objects when they live in collections. And I think one of the things that has been touched on already in the 2 talks that have preceded mine, and that will be coming up in my talk too, is the changing status of photographs within these very old collections. And I think that's a fascinating thing about the V&A's collection. So this image shows the very first exhibition of photographs that was held at the South Kensington Museum. And yet another first, it was taken by Charles Thurston Thompson, who was appointed in 1856 as the museum's first official photographer and the head of the world's first museum photographic service. Thurston Thompson was charged with photographing objects that were on loan to the museum, that belonged to the museum, sometimes sneaking in a little self-portraiture on the side. He was also sent out to photograph places around the world. So this is an example of an assignment he had to go and photograph Santiago de Compostela, and he made numerous photographs there at the same time that someone from the museum had been sent out to make casts of the facade. And so it's actually, I think, a really interesting story, but it's not one I'm going to go into today. But the intersections between the use of casts, because the V&A has a tremendous 2 huge rooms full of casts still today, and photography, both as reproductive forms and both ways of kind of collecting the world in a way and reproducing art and architecture, or architecture especially, and sculpture for the use of audiences back in the UK. And on the right, what we see, yes, on your right, is a photograph that was taken by Isabel Agnes Cowper. She was actually Charles Thurston Thompson's sister, and she took over as official photographer to the museum when he died in 1868. And this photograph that you see here was actually a photograph, oops, sorry, I was trying to point, is a photograph of one of the casts. Some of the photographs that were made of the cathedral itself didn't come out well enough, and so in an album that was put together of the cathedral, some of the photographs of casts were included in place of original photographs of the place itself. So there are a number of examples in the V&A's collection of deep holdings that were acquired for one reason, but have come to be appreciated for others. So Muybridge is one example. The South Kensington Museum were among the original subscribers to the complete set of animal locomotion. That's over 700 works. And these, of course, are admired now as proto-cinematic and very visually appealing photographs. but they were acquired at the time for the very reason that they were made as studies of animal locomotion that would be useful to artists. Another example of photographs that have whose status has changed very much are Atget's. But long before he was considered a modern master or a proto-surrealist, actually by then it was the V&A, because it was around 1903 to 1905. The V&A collected over 600 photographs directly from Atget. But of course, they were interested in them not for these kind of eerie, surrealistic moments that you find in Atget, but because of the subject matter. These are records, and we have dozens and dozens of doorknobs, for example, photographed by Atget, because that's what was interesting to and fit within the remit of the V&A. So as I've been showing, the photography was deeply embedded in the museum's educational mission, and education itself was deeply embedded in the mission of the museum. And just before I turn in more detail to Julie Margaret Cameron, I wanted to put it into a little bit more context. The fact that here was a female photographer who succeeded in getting her work collected and exhibited by the South Kensington Museum at a time when you had to have a female antique classroom, which you may or may not be able to see. All the men are modestly covered. And the lecture room in which this sign, so that's the sign here, which I didn't think you'd be able to read, so I've written it out for you. A matron will always be present with the female students on in the class lecture room. So, I mentioned that it's the 150th anniversary of Cameron's work being collected by the South Kensington Museum, and it's actually almost 150 years to the day that Henry Cole, the director of the museum, recorded in his diary that having his portrait done by Cameron. He wrote, "To Mrs. Cameron's Little Holland house," that was her sister's home in London, "to have my portrait photographed in her style. A German girl held an umbrella over me." And there are a few things that are so remarkable about this. First of all, Julie Margaret Cameron obtained her first camera and began making photographs, took up photography in earnest in 1864. In January of 1864 is the photograph that she calls her first success. She was given the camera at the age of 48 as a gift from her daughter and son-in-law. So she's been taking photographs for less than 18 months, and she already has a style of her own. I think that's really remarkable. So unfortunately, the the portrait that was made of Cole on that occasion is lost. But in this one, which was made during that same period, during her visit to Little Holland House, in this one you can see a sliver of the umbrella and a little hand holding it. Very soon after Julie Margaret Cameron took up photography, she classified the types of photographs that she was making in an album that she gave to a friend. She classified them as portraits, Madonna groups, and fancy subjects for pictorial effect. So we're seeing an example of each. And in fact, well, as you can tell by the date, because this is from 1867, this is this portrait of Herschel. I've just shown because it's a great example of her portraiture, was not one of the ones that was collected in 1865, but was acquired later. So the day after Henry Cole writes of that portrait sitting in his diary, Julia Margaret Cameron writes to Henry Cole. And she says, "I send you my portfolio. I should be so proud and pleased if this complete series could go into the South Kensington Museum." And sure enough, the following month, Henry Cole puts on the museum agenda purchase photographs from Mrs. Cameron, and the first purchase was made. So in total, I mentioned 114 photographs were acquired from Julie Margaret Cameron that year. The first batch was acquired in June, a second group was acquired in July, and then a third in September of that year. And until recently, it was assumed, the first group of photographs has always been understood to be a purchase. And the second two have always been referred to as donations. But actually, the research that I've done in the past couple of years in the V&A archives suggests that those two subsequent acquisitions were also purchases. I haven't actually found the invoices, but there are references to invoices, and they have prices next to them which add up to the right amount that she then later acknowledges receiving. So although she was very generous with giving away her prints, she also did want to earn money from photography, and so it's not surprising that she would have actually sold them to the museum. But in terms of the initial group of photographs, the ones that were definitely a purchase, what's striking about it is that the types of photographs that were collected fell into those first two categories of Madonnas and fancy subjects for pictorial effect. So this means that Henry Cole chose to collect the types of photographs that Cameron was making that were most self-consciously art photographs, the photographs in which she was most obviously aspiring to make high art. And all of the photographs that were collected initially also happened to all have been of either women or children, with the one exception of Whisper of the Muse, in which Cameron's great friend and mentor, the artist G.F. Watts, poses with two young girls receiving inspiration from them. So when later that year, November of that year, the photographs were actually exhibited, and one review that mentions them says, "I find Mrs. Cameron's photographs awarded a prominent place at the South Kensington Museum, close to the picture collections, where they hang in their pride alone." So this does seem to be a remarkable instance of a museum that tends to collect photographs for their documentary qualities, all of a sudden recognizing photography as an art form. And it's as this momentous occasion is often referred to in many of the histories that have been written about Julia Margaret Cameron and about the history of the V&A's collection, that the V&A was so ahead of its time in recognizing photography as an art form because Cameron was somebody who so clearly was making photography that she intended to be artistic. And it would seem that Henry Cole was endorsing that view by showing these photographs near the picture galleries, hung as pictures in their own right. And they're in great contrast to yet another example of the types of photographs that were collected by the museum. I've chosen to show you this example because these photographs of trees in winter and summer by Edward Fox were acquired in between that July group of photographs and the September group of photographs. So these were being collected at exactly the same time as Julia Margaret Cameron photographs, yet they appear to be something that serve a completely different purpose. And their purpose is outlined in the title, the very long title of the portfolio that they're from, The Anatomy of Foliage, photographed examples of the principal forest trees, each taken from the same point of view in winter and summer, enabling the student to trace the limbs when hidden by the masses of foliage. So although today we can admire these as well, beautiful photographs and perhaps meditations on the passage of time, which is something that photography is so well suited to representing, at the time, they were very deliberately made as tools or aids to artists. Now, in the subsequent groups of photographs, some portraits were acquired. These groups of photographs that are perhaps donations, perhaps purchases. Although it's still overwhelmingly other types of photographs, the Madonna groups or the pictorial subjects. And among the portraits, although there are a few of the, oh, sorry, I think have I skipped a slide? No, I changed the order. Okay, wait, I'm just going to skip ahead to those. Although there are some that are her photographs, her portraits of so-called great men, like Tennyson and Robert Browning. many of them, or a surprising number of them, are actually portraits of her own family members. So we have this portrait of her teenage son, and the title, of course, includes this, I interpret as a sort of mournful mention of her youngest son having left home, but perhaps she's also trying to associate him with a kind of prestigious, the prestige of his boarding school. The title being Henry Herschel Hay Cameron of Charterhouse. But she also sold or gave them a number of photographs of her infant grandson. And as another person who saw the exhibition remarked, Mr. Cole put her photographs in the Kensington Museum, where she took me to see them. They're very beautiful, and as usual, she treats the many-headed monster, the public, as her dear familiar and gossip, writing in large hand on these photographs, my grandchild, Julia Margaret Norman, age 6, with her nurse, and so on. This is actually quite an inaccurate description because her grandchild was not age 6, and there were no photographs of her granddaughter in the collection, but there were a number of her grandson, and she does indeed write on them in great detail. And you can see she wrote it all the way, she couldn't even fit it all in. She had to go up around the side to get in all of this biographical information. Now, so this was just to give you a little bit more of a sense of the full picture of what was acquired. But as I said, it would appear that the South Kensington Museum and Henry Cole were recognizing photography as an art form. But there are a few pieces of evidence that I've encountered that I think counter this and bring this into question, and that's what I want to point us towards now. So this is the 1868 index to photographs in the National Art Library, and I hope that you can see it on this giant screen. Under Figure Studies, we have drawings by Raphael. Sorry, I can't read it properly from here. Montaigne drawings. Sorry, Millet and Chardin, and down here, and right here then, From Nature by Mrs. Cameron. So Julia Margaret Cameron is being classified in the same, as an author of figure studies that are being kind of equated with photographs of drawings by old masters. And so it's also important to mention at this point that 4 of the photographs that Henry Cole purchased from her initially were of Madonna groups, and they were given to Gottfried Sykes, who was the designer engaged with developing decorative schemes for the inside and outside of the South Kensington Museum. So we know that 4 of them were given to a designer precisely as source material. And again, here, it seems like somehow they're being kind of equated with other photographs that are also kind of flat objects that an artist could look at to receive inspiration from. Another piece of interesting evidence is this. When Henry Cole was defending the use of photography at the South Kensington Museum, he stated this. I have here, and he wasn't necessarily talking about this particular image, I've just chosen this one. I have here a facsimile of one of Raphael's drawings. At a recent sale at Christie's, a drawing not larger than that and not finer in quality sold for more than £200. By the agency of photography and by the action of the department, any working man in the country may get it for 5 shillings. So I also find this quite astonishing, that Henry Cole, the director of the South Kensington Museum, seems to be suggesting that a photograph of a Raphael is really just as good as an original Raphael drawing. So if we then consider both this along with questioning kind of what exactly the purpose of the museum's collecting Julia Margaret Cameron's were, and we look at these side by side just to kind of think about this a little bit. If Henry Cole doesn't distinguish between an original Raphael drawing and a photograph of a Raphael drawing, perhaps he didn't really distinguish either between a photograph of a Raphael and a photograph, even though it says on it, "From Life," a photograph by Julia Margaret Cameron. And it's already come back up a couple of times. I mean, Malcolm covered this subject quite well, this idea of, and we're all very familiar with it, I think, this idea of the changing status of photographs. We're familiar with the idea of a science photograph, or a photograph taken for some reason other than as art, kind of becoming art in a way in our eyes, through its aesthetic appreciation and its display on gallery and museum walls. But I think what we're a little less accustomed to is thinking about something that was created to be a work of art, and that we still understand to be a work of art, but trying to understand somebody actually treating that in its own time, not as a work of art, but more in the way that you might expect one of these kind of record photographs to be treated. So I'm going to just kind of leave you with that open-ended question. It's something that I'm kind of puzzling through a little bit based on the research that I've been doing into our collection. So thank you.